Hello everyone and welcome to my spoiler-free review of Scream 6. This is going to be completely spoiler-free, going to try to avoid very significant plot details. If it's not shown in the trailer, basically I'm not going to talk about it. So Scream has always been probably my favorite horror franchise. I think it's one of the most consistent horror franchises out there. And ever since Radio Silence took over for Wes Craven, who tragically passed away back in 2015, I was a little bit nervous to see how the franchise would turn out. And then Scream 5, which came out last year, was actually a pretty big surprise. It wasn't a perfect sequel, but it definitely did a good job of balancing introducing new characters and bringing back the old characters, and also sort of including that self-aware, sort of comedic tone that the previous Scream movies had. Going into a movie like this, I have certain expectations, those being, of course, you have a whodunit element. You want the mystery of who Ghostface is to be really strong and sort of keep you on your toes and keep you guessing. Number two, you want to have introduction of new good characters and of course the growth of the previous characters, because this is a long-running series. Scream 5 introduced essentially a whole new set of leads, and those four characters carry over into this one, and now they're heading to the Big Apple. And that setting change is really one of the things that helped this movie stay really fresh for me. I had an absolute blast with Scream 6. It's not perfect, and it's definitely one of the lesser sequels in my opinion, but I still really enjoyed it. Right from the get-go, the opening scene of this movie does something that no other film in this franchise has done before, and it piqued my interest right from the get-go. When it was first announced that this movie would be set in New York City, I had my concerns because, for one thing, it just seemed like the sort of situation where, you know, there's going to be people all over the place. How the hell is Ghostface going to jump out and stab somebody in clear view of hundreds, if not thousands, of people without being spotted and found? But watching this movie, it kind of reminded me that if I stumbled upon a situation like this, I see Ghostface chasing somebody around, I'm probably not going to help. I'm probably going to run the other way. And I think most people would probably do the same thing. So in a sense, I almost feel like the New York City setting is more scary in a certain sense and adds for more suspense, particularly in a few key sequences. There's a scene in this movie that takes place on a subway, and it was really suspenseful because not only do you have multiple people dressed up in Ghostface costumes because this takes place during Halloween, which, by the way, that backdrop is almost like blink and you'll miss it. They barely even touch on the fact that this movie takes place during Halloween, but it's coming out in March, so I guess. Anyways, not only does that give them the opportunity to showcase a lot of other horror icons like Pinhead and Freddy Krueger, I think there were a couple other ones in there too. But you've got a bunch of people dressed as Ghostface, you're in a crowded, packed area with tons of people. You don't know who the killer could be, and I think they play on that really well in this film. Another sequence that was absolutely excellent is the scene from the trailer that we've all seen where everyone has to climb on this ladder to sort of cross between these two high-rise apartment buildings, and that sequence is very suspenseful. It's very bloody. This movie as a whole is definitely the bloodiest Scream movie. Some people aren't going to like that because some people want a little bit more meta, a little bit more humor out of a Scream film. And this one has that too, but it definitely has this really brutal edge that the previous ones didn't have. In terms of the commentary this time around, I feel like the last one did a little bit better of a job because it focused in on requels. Although I've never really heard anyone use that term before outside of Scream, I think most people just call them soft reboots, where you have a decades-old franchise that gets revived, and you know the deal. You've heard the characters explain it in the movie. This one, on the other hand, just sort of comments on long-running franchises and horror tropes, but it sort of focuses specifically on the previous Scream movies. There are a lot of Easter eggs in this to killers in the previous movies, characters that some of which return, and of course just the events of the original trilogy. I gotta say, just as a fan of the franchise, I appreciate that they included all of that and found an organic way to sort of weave it into the story. It's really cool to see how all the old Ghostface masks, which are all withered and torn, are being worn by this new killer. That was a really creative choice. In terms of the characters, I was a little apprehensive going into this because this is the first Scream movie with no Neve Campbell. She didn't want to come back due to a pay dispute, which I totally respect. And to be honest, I think the movie might be better off without her. Because looking at it, we now have new lead characters with Sam and Tara Carpenter, so if they tried to bring her back as a supporting character in each movie, it would just start to feel redundant because she would really serve no purpose in this story. She would just pop up to be like, hey, I've been through this before, so I'll help you guys out again. I just feel that would have been a sloppy way to include her character, and maybe it's time for this new blood to sort of take on the mantle of the franchise if they're going to keep going forward with it. And I gotta say, as someone who wasn't a huge fan of Melissa Barrera's performance as Sam in the previous movie, I actually think she does a really good job here of sort of, combining that really suppressed, unhinged nature that kind of runs in her blood because she's Billy Loomis's daughter. Also, with the fact that she's a survivor of Ghostface attacks, she takes that blend and creates a really, really solid performance. Of course, Jenna Ortega as her sister is really good as well. And I think this movie as a whole gives the core four, as they've been dubbed, a lot more development. Chad and Mindy, played by Mason Gooding and Jasmine Savoy Brown, all of these actors do a great job, and I think the characters are deepened here more so than the last movie. The last movie was introducing so many characters that a lot of them just kind of felt like cannon fodder, so I appreciate that they sort of hone in on specific characters and give them development. Of course, we do have the return of Gale Weathers, who is the only character left from the original movie that's still here. And yeah, her role does feel a little bit shoehorned at times, but I will say there is one sequence, you've seen it in the trailer, with her in her apartment and Ghostface attacks. It is one of the best scenes in this entire franchise. And that's really the best thing I can say about Scream 6, is that the tension is so high, and there are a couple of key sequences that I think are among my favorite of the franchise. As a whole, it does have some issues, and we're going to get into that soon, but one more thing I want to mention is that Kirby also comes back in this movie. Very great to see her back after she was probably the best new character in Scream 4. Of course, her death was left purposely ambiguous so they could bring her back if they wanted to. I don't think she's quite as fun in this movie because she's not just the horror nerd anymore. Now she's kind of an FBI agent and sort of just takes on a more generic role, but it's still nice to see her there. There's one sequence where her and Mindy have a conversation about horror sequels. Absolutely loved that as a horror fan. But without spoiling things, I do want to talk about the third act of this movie because that's where I think most of the issues lie. I would say that this movie probably has the weakest killer reveal of all 6 movies and also the weakest motive. They're just a lot more simplistic than I figured they would be, especially given all of the grand sort of introduction of Easter eggs in this movie. You've got ghost faces that are wearing the costumes of the original killers. So I kind of expected it to be a lot more interconnected with the previous movies. Instead, it's a pretty simplistic but serviceable reveal. The people that don't like the cheesiness of some of these Scream movies are going to really hate the motive and sort of hate the performances in the third act because a lot of it does get silly and hammy and there are some kind of ridiculous one-liners in there. I didn't personally mind it too much. I just thought it was a little bit weak compared to the first 2 acts of this movie. The first 2 acts of this movie are probably among my favorite in the franchise. One other issue that I do have is that characters in this movie, there are 2 specific instances I'm thinking of where characters get stabbed about 20 times and then 5 seconds later they're walking around like it never happened. Or maybe not walking around like it never happened, but walking around just fine. And it would be one thing if these people get stabbed and then they're comatose, getting shipped off in an ambulance, never to be seen again. And that does happen occasionally too. But when somebody gets this much punishment and is somehow just walking around fine, it takes me back to the earlier movies when people would die from one off-screen stab to the back, and here you have people taking just 20 of them right in the chest and are just fine. That kind of takes you out of the moment a little bit. I know Scream is sort of one of the more self-aware, silly, cheesy franchises that isn't meant to be taken completely serious, but you got to stick to some amount of logic in order for the audience to go along with it, and here I think they just stretch the credibility a little bit. I guess I'm just surprised that the 6th movie in this franchise, despite being fairly formulaic, is this good. It is formulaic, I will admit. If you've seen the first couple of Scream movies, you know exactly what to expect in this movie. There's nothing outright shockingly different about it, but it's so entertaining and so much fun to watch, especially if you're a fan of horror movies, which it is my favorite genre. So I feel like the Scream franchise is just never going to get old as long as they keep up this consistency. Again, if they just changed some things in the third act, maybe toned down the cheesiness a little bit, and maybe added a little bit more to the killer's motive, I think this could have been one of the best Scream sequels. As of right now, it's probably my 4th or 5th favorite, but again, that's not really bad when you're considering the consistency of this franchise. There's not really a single one in here that I hate. Scream 3 is probably the weakest, but Really, I like all of the rest of them. So with that said, I'm going to give Scream 6 an 8 out of 10. This is another really solid entry into the franchise. So guys, definitely let me know down in the comments what you think of this movie. What's your ranking of the Scream franchise? I know some people haven't liked these last two movies. Admittedly, there are some logical issues. Again, I think it all comes down to how much you're willing to suspend your disbelief, because this is such a meta franchise that sort of knows what it's doing and doesn't take itself entirely seriously. For me, I'm able to do that quite a bit because that's just my preference and my style of horror. Some people might not be into that, and that's perfectly fine too. Thanks for sticking around. Be sure to drop a like as well as comments. And tomorrow, or maybe even later today, I should be dropping my review for the Adam Driver movie that just came out, 65. So we'll see how that turns out, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.